Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and it just gets more lit. Today I am extremely honored to be joined by the newly elected chairperson of the Federal Council of the Democratic Alliance, Mam Helen Zille. Thank you so much for joining SMWX.
It's such a pleasure, Sizwe, to be with you.
Well, I didn't get an invitation to tea with Helen, so I thought I'd just take matters into my own hands.
And invite me for a glass of water. Next time you put at least a double H with a dash of O and some Chivas Regal.
Well, my goodness, what a time for us to be having this conversation. The meeting with senior DA leaders has just happened, and you've been elected to a very powerful position in the DA. Before we get on to all that's happening, what's this been like for you?
Fun. You know, I love pressure. My autobiography is called Not Without a Fight, so I like flexing my muscles. But I also like relaxing and being amongst good people with sound values as I interpret them. So it's been a lovely couple of days. Yes, thanks.
And why did you take this decision? And can you take us into some of the internal battle that must have gone on? Of course, you've left the DA, you've come back.
No, I've never left the DA.
Senior leadership positions within the DA. And why did you decide to take this momentous decision?
Well, the DA and its constitution, which is a very powerful document, represents what I believe are the values and the principles that can make South Africa work for all, that can make us a prosperous country, that includes everybody in a growing economy, and that can redress the legacy of the past. I genuinely believe that. And so whatever anybody in the DA ever says to me, or however nasty anybody is to me, that's irrelevant. It embodies the values that I think can make South Africa work. So I've never ever left the DA. I've always continued working for it. In all elections, I've been going door to door. I moved temporarily to Bloberg Strand. I immediately joined the DA branch there, and I'm very proud to say, elected the chair of the Bloberg Strand branch. So I was very pleased about that. So I've been with the DA all the time. I had absolutely no intention of going back into leadership. I, in fact, had started my new career, which is in media, just like you. That is the career I originally came from. I started my little media company, the Godzilla Media Group, which I quite liked as a name. And I was going to explore all kinds of other information technology mechanisms to fight the battle of ideas that I think are essential for South Africa's future. I had all of that up my sleeve. And then I was approached to stand for the chair of Federal Council.
So it didn't come from you, it was more being approached from the outside.
It definitely did not come from me.
Did you have to be convinced for a long time?
Well, at first I just dismissed it as a joke. I had just been elected, literally the night before, I had just been elected chair of the Bloberg Strand branch. So I said to people, stop joking. And they called me and said, you shouldn't be standing for chair of the Bloberg Strand branch, you should be standing for chair of the Federal Council. So I said, oh, don't go away. And then people phoned me and badgered me a bit, and I asked my husband, and he said, are you mad? And then he went to play tennis, and he came back, and we slept on it, and he woke up early in the morning and said, you know, I've been thinking about it. You need to throw your hat in the ring. And the overwhelming reason was this. I really do believe that I've got a lot to contribute. The DA has been through a very, very difficult time. And I would never rest with my conscience if I didn't do my very best to make sure that in service to the leadership and in service to the values of the party, I try to help get us back on a growth path, on a stable, unified growth path again.
So this position, just glancing at the DA constitution, is a very important position.
Correct.
But before we get that, let's just get the facts straight, because I've seen so many reports that don't even know the difference between the deputy chair and the federal chair and the chairperson of the Federal Council. What is the chairperson of the Federal Council within the DA, and what are your responsibilities as chairperson of the Federal Council?
The chairperson of the Federal Council is the nexus around which all the systems, structures, processes of the DA come together. And it's also the interface between the administration and the political side of the DA. So it's where everything comes together. It's almost like the center of the spokes of a bicycle wheel. That's what that position is. And the leader is the person who steers and drives the bicycle. So the wheels are really important, but the leader decides, and with all the other processes in the party, decides in which direction to steer the bicycle.
So you've really returned to essentially a fundamental position within the DA.
Yes, I was elected to a very fundamental position yesterday.
And now the question presents itself as to where to from here for the party. At your federal, the meeting of the Federal Council, a report was presented about the state of the DA after the election. And there are a number of questions that need to be answered in the immediate term. A policy conference, for example, and of course, maybe an early federal Congress. Tell us a little bit about how you see things going in terms of the leadership of the party and the policy direction of the party in light of that report that was presented to the meeting.
Well, the DA is quite an extraordinary organization, especially in the broader political context. Because there is no other party that I know of in South Africa, nor on the continent, that would call such a fundamental review of itself by really high-powered independent individuals after a relatively small percentage drop in an election. If you look at the ANC, they've dropped from about 70% of the vote to 58% of the vote, and I think they've never done serious introspection, and certainly have never got people from the outside to do an in-depth analysis of where they went wrong. We drop 1 point something percent, and the leader has the guts and the vision and the confidence to appoint 3 highly intellectual, highly penetrating people in terms of understanding, in terms of analysis, to go into what went wrong, to get submissions from a whole range of people, and I know that they got scores and scores of written submissions, and then they did interviews as well, to distill all of that and write up a report saying this is what we think has gone wrong, and these are the recommendations we make to put it right. And then to put that in front of a federal council to discuss in depth. You cannot name another party, frankly, on this continent that would do that. And for that reason alone, the DA is a party that lives up to the values not only of its own constitution, but of our country's constitution, accountability, the rule of law, and all of those critical pillars of a functional society and a functional organization.
I think it is quite commendable, and by all accounts, no chairs were thrown, and a very difficult meeting was handled with some cordiality.
Absolutely.
But you do have very important questions to address. The leadership of the party and the policy direction of the party. Now look, you've been asked ad infinitum about Mmusi Maimane and what you think about him, and to be honest, I don't want to retrace those questions. But how will the DA emerge from this, given the perception that the party seems to be divided, and that those divides in some ways operate along racial lines?
They don't operate along racial lines at all. If there'd been a racial vote in the Federal Council yesterday, I could not have won by the margin that I won by, believe me. It would not have been possible.
Was it a big margin?
It was a nice margin, put it that way, a very nice margin. So the DA, again, is the only organization that I know of in South Africa where people will decide on the issues and not the color of a person's skin. And that is something to celebrate in a society where the issues are the issue and not your biology, and not your demography, and not your X or Y chromosome. And I'm very proud to be part of an organization that looks at the issues and makes decisions on that basis. So having said that, we emerged having taken unanimous agreement on resolutions arising out of that report. Now, obviously there was an in-depth debate. Yes, there were quite tough disagreements on certain issues. As you say, no chairs were thrown. As you say, there wasn't a huge fight about who is eligible to be a delegate or who isn't. There was no money that changed hands. There was none of that kind of stuff that is rife in other political organizations. We ran our process immaculately and fairly. And at the end of the day, we came out with a set of resolutions to which everyone had agreed, and which it will be, to a large extent, my responsibility and the organization's responsibility to see implemented, because I'm accountable to the Federal Council, and it's my job to make sure that its decisions are implemented.
I remember when Mmusi Maimane actually burst onto the political scene, and it was in large part, and I think this has been something left out of the narrative through your intervention in the party, or at least you two had a very close political relationship.
And we still do. We've had a number of conversations today on the telephone, and you know, we have a cordial, respectful, professional relationship.
If you were to advise him about the early Congress and whether he should persist in his position?
Well, let me firstly say, I said I would stay in my lane. And my lane is to execute the mandate of the Federal Council and the leadership. If he asks me what I think, I will consider the issues and give an answer. If he doesn't ask me what I think, I will keep quiet.
So you're prepared to give him a view of what you think if he gives you a nice call?
If he asks me. Otherwise, I keep quiet.
You can always tell us what you think, and then we can...
No, I'll tell him, because he must ask me, not Sizwe.
So, look, you've painted a picture of a party kind of coming out of a very difficult process through procedures that are to be commended and actually, you know, to be a source of inspiration. The other side of that coin is a party that's deeply divided, and a party where senior leaders are resigning and more may threaten to resign. And of course, the Joburg mayor, Herman Mashaba, as we speak, is just in the afterglow of his resignation speech. And he mentioned you specifically and said your ascension to this center of the bicycle wheel of the DA heralds a new direction in the party which he cannot stand by. How do you respond to the Herman Mashaba's statements and the fact that he thinks your election is symbolic of a new direction in the DA?
Well, I'd love to chat to Herman, but it's again not my job to go over the leader's head to talk to Herman. I know the leader has been speaking to Herman. But there's some things that Herman should explain and should be asked by journalists to explain with great respect. Herman joined the party when I was the leader. And I've just noticed on Twitter, my Twitter memories, that there's a wonderful tweet that Herman sent out when he joined the party while I was the leader, with his arm around my shoulders saying something like my inspiration or words to that effect referring to me. I was the same person then. I had the same values then. It's very strange. A decade ago, but definitely 2 decades ago, it was very progressive to believe passionately in non-racialism and to live out that belief. Suddenly, it's become conservative. In the United States, if you say you're non-racial, it's called a microaggression, if you wouldn't mind. And we just adopt that kind of stuff willy-nilly in a country where we've got a tiny shrinking minority of people who want to make a massive contribution to this country and keep on being defined as the problem. Now that seems crazy to me. And I really do believe that when Herman joined the party, he was a committed non-racialist, as I am today and as I have always been. in the home that I grew up in the example I had from my parents. And more than that, the great irony was that I was considerably to the left of Herman in terms of economic policy. He's always been a free market fundamentalist. I'm not. I've always believed there's a crucial role for a capable state to play, especially in a divided society like ours. And he was very opposed to things like BBBEE and even fundamentally opposed to social grants. Now, where I agree with him is it's much better for people to have a good job than to be dependent on a social grant. Absolutely. But I thought, well, Herman's to the right of us, but he's in the broad ballpark of believing in non-racialism, a market economy, the rule of law, a capable state, and above all, policies that grow the economy to get people into jobs and beat poverty, which is our #1 requirement. And so I welcomed him warmly into the party. I helped to recruit him. I wasn't the only one, but I helped to recruit him in the party. And so Herman needs to say to me, what's changed? Has he become a captive of the EFF? Because I haven't changed. So what's the problem? I haven't changed. Maybe he has. I think he was very worried that my coming into this position would mean the end of our cooperative agreement with the EFF in Johannesburg. Well, Herman must read our constitution. I have no power to change any of that. I can't act outside my powers. These are decisions that the party structures take and that I then have to implement.
So I think on that, there are two ways one can be to the left.
Mm-hmm.
Socially, well, probably three actually, politically, but I think we all agree in democratic politics. There's the economic question where I think
Herman's to the right. Yes.
But there are questions about race and racial redress,
yes,
where he may be to the left of you
depends
legitimately.
It depends how you define
well
left. I don't think that race classification is left.
Can I just finish?
Yes.
Because, as you know,
you certainly can.
As you know, we have all the time in the world.
Okay, sorry to interrupt
no
you.
problem.
I'm listening.
And it does seem as though those in the DA who are less committed to racial redress, who are less committed to state interventionary policies which try to ameliorate the legacy of apartheid, have scored a victory now. And the prediction is that DA policy will shift at this policy conference and shift in the direction of a less ardent belief in a more aggressive approach to racial redress.
Says where this is going to be the most important answer that I'm going to give you.
It is.
Everybody in the DA is absolutely committed to redress. Absolutely committed. And we're all committed to a capable state having a role in that by following policies and practices and building institutions that are capable of doing that. There's not a single person in the DA that disagrees with that. In 2013, we even adopted a policy that said we would try to see whether using race as a proxy for disadvantage would help the situation or worsen it, and we agreed that every 5 years we would review that position. We have seen what has happened to using race as a proxy for disadvantage. What has happened is that unemployment has grown from 3.6 million in 1994 to over 10 million today. So there are more people who are disadvantaged, and those who are disadvantaged are much more disadvantaged. But under the fig leaf of racial redress, a few politically connected people have looted the state to become extremely wealthy, bankrupt state-owned enterprises, and cause the risk of the South African economy collapsing. And Jacob Zuma was quite right when he said, I did nothing wrong. I was just implementing BBBEE policies. And if you look at it, that's what he was doing, because it became legalized corruption. It sounds very good to say racial redress. What has happened? We've seen a fig leaf for massive corruption by politically connected people. And the more broadly people say we're going to apply BBBEE, the more narrow it has become. So before, anyone who had scored less than 10 million rand through those transactions was seen as being empowered. Now you have to score more than 50 million rand to be empowered. Which white people have got 50 million rand around? None. But you're still disadvantaged if you're black and you haven't scored by these preferential deals up to 50 million rand or more. Do you see how it's abused for corruption, for manipulation, for deviating supply chain to the politically connected? Now, 5 years after we looked at that policy, we are reassessing, as we promised we would. And we've said now there's much better data. You don't need race as a proxy for disadvantage. You can measure disadvantage for disadvantage. You aren't disadvantaged, with great respect, Sizwe. And to say that your race makes you disadvantaged is absurd. Recently, I had an interview with Adam Habib, and he said that when his sons apply for scholarships or for fellowships, being the sons of vice-chancellors, he can look over their applications and they are in the inside track. They can't claim disadvantage. They're massively advantaged. So you cannot anymore, and less so, use race as a proxy for disadvantage, but people who have an interest in constantly manipulating systems to their own financial advantage obviously want to keep race, because that's how they get through their biology into the inside track. And that's the ANC's game, and that's the EFF's game. But we have to be the alternative to that. We can't outrace the ANC and the EFF on race.
Sure.
We've got measures of disadvantage. Let me give you one other example. Weren't you a Rhodes Scholar?
Can I just
Were
come
you a
in?
Rhodes Scholar?
Can I come in
You
for
certainly
a moment?
can.
I mean,
certainly can. I'm keeping quiet now. I'm listening to you.
Before this turns into HZX. But look, the important part of this platform is allowing people in something of an unfiltered way to put their positions across.
I like that. Thank you.
And to leave our audience to make up their own minds.
Good.
But I want to come back on some of what you've said, because I think we would both agree that the ANC's tenure, particularly over the last 5 years, has been an utter disgrace and an utter disaster. I'm not sure about the causal link that you draw between a program of racial redress and state-led corruption. I'm not sure that it's because people are black or because there is blackness as a proxy for disadvantage that we've had that corruption. I think the corruption itself is a major problem which our society needs to invest time in combating, and the DA has done good work in doing that. But I think the separate question is the deep oppression of black South Africans in our history and in our present. And I think those are two separate questions that need to be kept separate, because it's quite possible to have a non-corrupt state that still engages in policies of racial redress. That's the one thing. The second thing...
No, I'm not going to remember the second thing, so would you mind if I just answered the first thing?
Oh my goodness, but how was I going to remember
You're younger than me. You're younger than me.
Well...
Your neurons are more connected.
Well...
I need a piece of paper so I can write down the things if you're going to give me a list.
Okay, by all means.
Good.
Take out the piece of paper. It was just the notion that corruption and race-based redress are not necessarily one and the same thing.
They're absolutely not one and the same thing.
And that the link between those two is not as clear as you suggest it is.
Right.
That's number one. Number two is just this question about privilege. And there are surely different dimensions of privilege. So I agree with you fully that, I went to St. John's. I had lots of books in my house, and there are various ways in which I've been extremely advantaged in South African society. But that doesn't mean that being black doesn't apply. So there are certain ways in which I do experience racism, and every black South African experiences racism. So if we ignore the way race affects even people who are economically or socially privileged, then we ignore a large way that South African society has actually informed their experiences.
Right. Let me answer those questions.
Sure.
If we can take it away from the colour of your skin,
Mm-hmm.
let's take it to the colour of eyes. Let's say we were to say people with blue eyes have historically been disadvantaged.
Mm.
So what we need is a massive program of advantaging people with blue eyes. When the data tells you that people with blue eyes, green eyes and brown eyes are not the marker for disadvantage anymore, and that you should measure it in other ways, the people with blue eyes who were previously advantaged are going to have a massive vested interest in retaining it, and will come up with every argument in the book to do so. What I'm saying in this, it's not a function of race or blackness that such a system becomes corrupt. It is a result of the system itself. And whatever arbitrary biological criterion you would use would result in people hiding behind that and manipulating that for their own advantage and losing sight of the purpose for which it was established initially. If the real purpose is to redress disadvantage caused by the past, we can measure that. We don't need blue eyes, we don't need green eyes, we don't need skin color to measure that. So why are people so obsessed at holding on to the skin color? It's only because it gives people, whether they're advantaged or disadvantaged, an inside track.
Either that, or there really is a deep oppression in a society that has had that deep oppression for centuries that actually influences people's experiences. And so they keep speaking about the way they experience that oppression.
Right.
Because they really do experience that oppression.
Right.
And just give me a chance here. And so maybe it's not that people just want to get BEE deal. I don't have any BEE deals. It's not that people want to get BEE deals. It's that they actually experience racial oppression in a way that deeply affects their lives, and therefore they keep harping on the fact that they experience this oppression. Number one. Number two is that why shouldn't we focus on race if the historical marker was race? So I think in your analogy, what you failed to mention is that people with blue eyes were systematically and legally privileged by the system.
Okay.
So why should we not use blue eyes in a situation where in the historical precedent the blue-eyed people had been privileged? It doesn't mean people with blue eyes are somehow inherently different or oppressive, but it just means that the way of ameliorating the situation should follow the way that the system was enforced in the first place.
Okay. If BBBEE worked, there wouldn't be 3 times as many impoverished people today as there were at the end of apartheid. Now, I'm not saying that apartheid was better. I'm saying the mechanism to redress the terrible legacy of apartheid made that legacy worse. There are 3 times the number of unemployed people and a tiny little group of massively enriched, politically connected people. So you have to admit that that approach has been a massive failure. Now you are saying, well, that was just pilot error. That was just a bunch of corrupt people in charge. Well, take a look at the EFF and VBS and the looting of VBS and the front companies and this and that, all justified by the fact we were historically disadvantaged. Now we can set up all of these mechanisms and these front companies because we deserve to drive Porsches and Ferraris and all of these things, and people are only going to complain about that because we're black. Nonsense. It's got nothing to do with your colour. It's got something to do with the corruption. That's the issue. Now you name me one instance across the board where politicians implementing BBBEE have not degenerated into corruption. The private sector in many instances hasn't, because they've still got to make a profit. And so other criteria such as capacity, performance, ability all come into play. But when it is state-owned enterprises, you can put your quote-unquote friend, Dudu Myeni, in as the chair of the board of SAA and lose 18 billion and have her say she can't afford to travel from Durban to Pretoria for a court case. Because you're not interested at all in whether she can do the job of leading an airline and chairing the board of an airline. You're interested that this is a pal of yours that needs a position. When you look at Eskom, and this is the biggest disaster of all, it is about to bankrupt and destroy this whole country's economy. And when you look at the statistics and figures, it's not been a company that's focused on generating and transmitting electricity. No, it's a socio-political experiment in enriching a group of cadres, massively pushing up the base of employment, reducing generation, putting a whole range of middlemen to become rich in between, all on the basis of BBBEE policies. So you tell me, where has government implemented those policies where it has not done anything else but through corruption enrich a tiny little group? We have to be a strong opposition and expose that, and to say you've disadvantaged even more the disadvantaged, most of whom happen to be black. So the way to stop that is to take away your fig leaf of elite racial empowerment, black elite enrichment. That's the real acronym spelled out of BEE, black elite enrichment, and say let's empower the disadvantaged. Let's genuinely empower the disadvantaged and have the state playing a role in that. That's what we stand for. That's progressive. It is much more progressive than BBBEE.
Okay, so I don't think it is progressive. I think...
Well, you've got a reason not to.
Well...
I mean, look at Malaysia.
Just let me tell you why. Because I think that in large part we're confusing BBBEE with the principle of racial redress. And I think that unless BBBEE is the only way to redress racial imbalances, and there is no other way, then that argument would be right. But there are various other ways.
That's exactly my point. That's exactly my point.
But my point is that that's not correct. That there is a perfectly feasible policy of racial redress open to South Africa in which we acknowledge the role of race, but we have a state which is not as corrupt as the ANC has become. And we pursue that doggedly until our society more adequately reflects the equalities that we seek. That's the aim and the goal that I think we should be working towards, as opposed to saying we've failed to implement racial redress adequately, and therefore we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and remove the principle of racial redress as a whole. And,
well,
and I might just add that I think it's a racialist policy to remove BE. It's an attempt to appeal to the race and the convictions of white South Africans who don't like BEE, but to shroud it in the language of liberalism in such a way as to pretend that it's not a racial appeal. So I think there is a politics of race at play, but it's not the one you mentioned. It's the one that voters of the Freedom Front Plus want to hear.
If you are really committed to redress, then you say, we need to find all the people who are still disadvantaged by the policies of the past and make sure that we're following policies to empower them and that the state plays a role in that. Of course, the large majority of such people who are the beneficiaries of that will be black. But you don't have to define it in that way unless you have an ulterior motive. And the ulterior motive is to enrich the political elite. There has never been another outcome. It's like saying, well, all of the history of massive failures of socialism have only been pilot error, because no one's ever done socialism right. But one day someone will come along and do socialism right, which has never ever happened. The latest example is Venezuela. So to say you can get race classification and get race-based redress and get people who have a vested interest in that race-based redress because of their own race to implement a system that doesn't specifically advantage them but advantages the mass of people who should benefit is like saying socialism can work when it never ever has in any system anywhere in the world. Always pilot error, always we can get it right. The fact is that we've seen that the ANC is massively corrupt. And it can't be fixed because it is an interlocking network of patronage systems. So it's who is going to benefit out of the competing patronage systems, not the principle of using your political power to benefit yourself materially. And that is made to look very nice by this little cloak of BBBEE. We say you can count people who are disadvantaged. You know where they are. And 99% or probably 95% of them are going to be black South Africans. But at least you're not re-enriching the political elite. That is why we say de-racialize it. And that is the progressive policy. It's got nothing to do with appealing to white voters because most of them wouldn't benefit through the policy anyway. But they would be sure that their tax money isn't being fleeced off to 50 billion rand, pay for Gupta's weddings, go overseas. It's 250 million rand to upgrade in Kandla. People who pay massive amounts of taxes, and company tax has gone down as a proportion of tax, individual tax, 7 million taxpayers in South Africa, 7 million personal taxpayers in South Africa are shouldering the biggest bulk of the tax burden. Now those are black and white and whatever, but many of them are historically advantaged, and they would pay tax with pleasure if they knew that it was really going to advantage the disadvantaged. They are sick and tired of seeing their tax money filched off under this fig leaf of righteously called BBBEE, which is nothing but legalized corruption. And people are sick and tired of it. And let me talk a little bit about lived experience.
Okay.
Lived experience. Everyone has their lived experience. And no one's lived experience is more valid than anybody else's lived experience. But lived experience doesn't substitute for the interpretation of data, although it's very real to people. Now let me give you a little vignette of lived experience. Have you ever heard of a guy called Ntokozo Qwabe? He was
We were at Oxford together.
Yes, of course you were. So you couldn't get a more advantaged dude than Ntokozo Qwabe, who had an all expenses paid, lovely postgraduate education.
Not at all. He was packing boxes at ShopRite for.
Sure, we all were.
But
isn't that a coincidence?
That's a bit different, isn't it?
Isn't that a coincidence? I also used to pack bags at Checkers while I was at university.
But he lived in rural KZN
Yeah.
to a family born of extreme poverty.
Yes, and I was born to a family of refugees. But let us not go into all of that because
Okay.
that's not relevant here and now.
Okay.
Ntokozo Qwabe and his other mates come along to a little restaurant in Obs. And they're ordering a meal, and a waitress called Ashley Schultz, who happens to be white,
Yes.
and who happens to be very poor, and who happens to be the daughter of a single mother who is dying of cancer. Ashley Schultz is there waitressing to pay her way through university. But seeing biologically the color of her skin, they make all kinds of assumptions about her and about her lived experience. And she serves them and she does her best, and they write on the bill, "We will pay you a tip when you give us back our land." Now, who experiences racism in this country? We all do in different ways, Sizwe. And now we have experienced ESCOM in a way that we all do in this country. Because of racial policies in ESCOM.
Is that load shedding? No, sorry. Sorry, guys. Shit.
Carols by candlelight.
I like this. I hope you keep this in the podcast.
Oh my goodness, yeah, without doubt.
You must really keep this in the podcast because it shows you what happens when you apply racial policies at ESCOM.
So we were talking about lived experience before the electricity intervened on our lived experience. But let's take you back to the Ashley Schultz debacle.
Well, you know, that is one example that I'm saying. And, you know, we need to look very objectively at issues that people may experience as racism that may or may not be racism. Because there are lots of people who spend a hell of a lot of time looking for reasons to be offended. And will find them everywhere because there's a huge payoff for being constantly offended. We live in an environment where offense taking is the new status. We live in a society where there is some valorization of victimhood and a hierarchy of victimhood, so everybody looks to be a victim because that's how you get status in the society. And that gives everybody an incentive to look for reasons why they're being victimized. Believe me, everybody has a lived experience, and many of us know what it's like to be victimized. I've never played on the fact that I'm a woman. My goodness, no. I've never said, oh, well, it's because I'm a woman or this or that. Never. I would never do that. I would never demean myself to do that. I've never dined out on the fact that 15 of my close relatives were murdered in the death camps of Germany. Yes, they were. It's a historical fact. It's tragic. It caused many tragedies in my family. But it is what it is. And I've tried to move on. Not that I'm saying to everybody move on. I recognize that there are legacies of the past that have to be redressed. My parents were dirt poor, and my dad worked day and night to build a life for us. I understand that he was in a position where he could do that, partly because of the color of his skin. So I understand that legacy, and I understand it. My greatest privilege lies in having unbelievably decent parents who taught me values, who taught me how to work like a Trojan, who taught me how to never be a victim, who taught me how the quality of my own life was in my own hands. Now I know, and they taught me how to fight apartheid every inch of the way. It wasn't something that I learned from anybody else except my parents, because they had been so discriminated against in the country of their birth that they said never again in a country that we live in. Now, I strongly believe in redress, and I strongly believe in moving on, but everyone has had the experience of pain. Many people have had the experience of victimhood. When we valorize it and turn it into a mark of status, we're in deep trouble in society.
I just want to keep going with this conversation because there's so much. I mean, I keep wanting to ask the final question, but just on that point, I mean, I think there's a difference between saying that everybody has their own lived experience and has experienced different forms of oppression, which I think is perfectly true. And people on the other side of boundaries of oppression ignoring people who say that they're experiencing oppression. So I think it's very different for a white South African to profess to appreciate the racism that a black South African feels. And I think that is quite different from saying that white South Africans have a perfect life. Nobody's suggesting that. But on the question of race, it's to black South Africans that I think we should be turning our attentions. Just as in the case that you made on gender, I don't think men should profess to know what it's like to be under the oppression of gender oppression in our society. And so my problem to some extent is this attempt to profess to appreciate the oppression from the other side of a boundary that I think the DA might be accused of if you do, in your review of redress, decide to abandon the earlier trajectory.
We will take a much more progressive trajectory, that I can assure you, because racial classification and pencil tests and things like that is highly regressive in my book. Racial classification is something that has no place in a diverse society, because who the hell knows what color anybody is anymore, and who the hell cares? the bottom line is somebody disadvantaged? And how can we fix that? That is my point of departure. But I also agree with you very strongly that we have to have empathy. We have to have sympathy. We have to be able to see the world through the eyes of other people and the experiences of other people. And I do believe that men can genuinely empathize with the struggles that abused women experience and can join the struggle against that with absolute authenticity. And to exclude people because they haven't got the right chromosome from that struggle seems to me rather absurd. We would like everybody to be part of that struggle, not say, well, you can't know what it's like and you can't be with us because you happen to have a Y chromosome, so sit down. I believe in crossing boundaries. I believe that's progressive. I don't believe it's progressive to hive off in exclusive little biological groups based on identity and think that that is taking society forward. Not at all.
Let's close off, because we could probably do a day on this question of race, on this question of oppression. And I'm glad that we had that conversation, because I think it's, as you said, probably the most important one we're going to have.
Yes.
But let's end off back in the political realm, because as the DA enters this period of, let's call it, uncertainty, President Ramaphosa, many claim, has seized ground previously occupied by the DA. His new dawn has, I don't think I've ever seen a political moment like it in the South African media landscape, been swallowed hook, line and sinker. And there are many people who may even have been in the DA constituency who now think that Ramaphosa is the answer to our problems. And if we just give him enough time, we will finally see the light of this new dawn. Your views on that position?
Believing that is the core political problem we face. Look, most people have woken up with a hell of a hangover after the night before the new dawn. Believe me, the new dawn was magical thinking. There is no way that any leader of the ANC, no way, knowing that party and knowing that it's just an interlocking network of patronage networks, can really bring a new dawn. If Cyril Ramaphosa, and I believe he may want to, did the things that are necessary to create the new dawn, he would be out of power in a fortnight, because all of those patronage networks would get him out. I mean, he can't even do what is necessary with Eskom, one parastatal, because he's so terrified of the unions involved there. How is he going to get education right with the power of SATU and various other things? You see, that is the problem when you become a party that can't self-reflect, that can't renew, and that gets bogged down in patronage and race and those kinds of chains that prevent you from looking at the real issues that are preventing progress. So the ANC is a lost cause. Whatever the ANC does and whatever leader the ANC gets, it is structurally incapable of doing the things South Africa needs to improve. And the EFF is an absolute non-starter from the beginning, because they are fundamentally corrupt. And they run an authoritarian system which can't work in South Africa because I think the country is too inherently democratic. The DA is the only party that is genuinely non-racial, genuinely inclusive, has genuine internal accountability mechanisms, runs with fair internal institutions, and that is going to matter more and more in the future. And lastly, on this issue of the media, I really don't mean to say this in any patronizing sense at all, but I have lived a politically very conscious life since 1965 about. And I have never seen the media not getting excited at every new president that comes to South Africa. And they first get unbelievably excited and they think, oh, this is all going to be a change, and then they get massively disillusioned, and then we're back to square one. So yes, there was a lot of Ramaphoria, as they called it, around Cyril Ramaphosa. But the hangover came far more quickly than it did, for example, than it did after Zuma. Oh, they loved Zuma, and I was in trouble for months for saying something nasty about him after he'd been. And when I said stop Zuma, before the election. They said, oh, look at this racist saying stop Zuma. And in retrospect, if people had listened, we might not have had 9 wasted years.
Well, Helen Zille, you've been extremely generous with your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining SMWX. And is Tea with Helen still happening? Might I be invited one of these days?
I'd love you,
Well,
but you've got to get up people's noses first enough.
just make sure you don't serve water.
To you, to you, I would never serve water. But Sizwe, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for giving me so much of your time. Thanks for a very stimulating conversation, and thanks for giving me a chance to express my views, and thanks for pressing my pause button now and again.
Me? Never. Ayeye. Thanks for watching the content. Like, share and subscribe on all platforms. smwx.co.za to join the WhatsApp channel. And let's build a new conversation for a new generation. Ayeye.